Hello, welcome to historic Spring Creek Park. Today we're going to take a small tour of some of the local attractions, some of the sights to see here in this park. Spring Creek Park is the oldest park in Harris County. It was given to the county to use as a park in the 1950s. So it's been a county park for almost 65 years. The park site itself is very significant in the location. It's along a high ridge along Spring Creek Park. Native American Indians, the Akokisa and the Badai, used this park and used the creek as their mode of transportation. Because of the high bluff in the back of the park, Native Americans would set up camp here and would spend a couple of months along the area. Multiple artifacts have been found dating all the way back to 300 or 400 AD, showing that there was a native presence in this area. In early Texas, both during Mexican rule and independence and early statehood, Texas had a significant amount of beef cattle. The problem was getting them to market. Until the 1870s, there were no railroads where we could drive cattle north, put them on the railroads, and take them places. So instead, the cattle that were driven from Texas were taken to New Orleans, which was the hub of all manufacturing, all of everything in the South at the time. The main cattle drive road is along the entrance to Spring Creek Park, Brown Road. In historic times and on maps up until the 1880s, 1890s, it was actually known as Beef Road. It was the main cattle drive road from central Texas to New Orleans. They would drive their cattle along Brown Road and then along Spring Creek until it met up with the Atascocita Trace down around the modern day Humble. As part of this, and to bring attention to this important part of history, during the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo every year, a cattle drive comes through this area and actually stops and spends a couple of nights here at Spring Creek Park before moving on to the parade and the rodeo. In the late 1820s, Stephen F. Austin opened up land in one of his colonies for settlement along Spring Creek. About 1828, 1829, all the land between Waller and Tomball was claimed by families. These families received 4,428 acres of land along both sides of the creek. The creek ran in between the land, so part of their land was in Harris County, the other part in Montgomery County. These lots were sold for 12.5 cents an acre. That was the surveying fee. So families were flocking to Texas to get this land. The family that owned this piece of property, were the House family. Joseph House brought his family and his sons to Texas, claimed this land, and later on he sold part of his land to one of his sons and the other part to another son. The one son, Joseph House Jr., that owned the portion of the House property where Spring Creek Park is at, sold it to the Shearer family, a German immigrant family that got here in the 1840s. During this period, 1845 to 1850, there was a huge influx in Germans coming to the United States to escape political turmoil at home. A lot of them chose to take the southern route and come into the United States either through New Orleans or through Indianola, where Texas had its main port. The ones that came to Texas, most of them made it to the hill country, Fredericksburg, New Braunfels, places like that. But a large segment of them set up population in northern Harris County. They set up their churches, they set up their families, and they bought 200 to 400 acres of land from the original settlers for farms. And that's what started the great German presence in northern Harris County, in the Tomball area. During the 1860s, America faced one of its greatest crises of all time, the American Civil War. The Civil War affected the entire United States. It affected the deep southern states, and it also affected Texas, who was part of the Confederacy. While very few large-scale battles or large-scale operations happened in Texas, we did supply manpower for the Confederacy as well as goods and other services. Our plantations were sending cotton and food stuff to the Confederate Army. 90% of all of the men and boys in Texas fought in the Civil War. Anybody between ages of 15 and 50 were eligible for service. While most of the Texas people that served from Texas did not go fight in major battles in the East and in the Mississippi River area, most of them did defend the borders of Texas. We had people at the southern border from Mexico trying to create a whole new nation along the Rio Grande, and were invading Texas from the south. We had Native Americans in the north and west who saw the lack of United States troops in Texas as an opportunity to expand their range. So lots of Texans fought along the border. Lots of Texans also were involved in an invasion of New Mexico that happened in early 1862. So Texas did fight in the war. They did send men and they did send material. A lot of the German settlers in North Texas and in the Hill Country and also in Harris County were opposed to slavery in general and opposed to the war in general. So a lot of them tried to set out the war as conscientious objectors by supplying goods and other materials to the war effort. We're standing here at the site of the monument for the people killed in the powder mill explosion in 1863. During the war, local Germans in the area built a complex on the site of Spring Creek Park to produce materials and goods for the Confederacy. They had a powder mill, a sawmill, multiple blacksmiths, woodworkers, wheelwrights, and even people making clothing for the Army. However, in 1863, an accident at the powder mill caused it to explode, and it killed 3 of the German workers and an untold number of African Americans, some of who were free and some of who were slaves. They were not recorded on how many, but there are estimates of up to 20. The monument is dedicated to the men who lost their lives in that explosion and in that accident. And next, we're going to take a walk up to the historic African American cemetery that's also here at Spring Creek Park. Okay, now we're at the cemetery in the back of Spring Creek Park. This is one of the later features that happened historically. In 1884, the Shearer family sold 6.6 acres to the West Chapel Episcopal Methodist Church, a local African American church, to use as a cemetery. There's thoughts that some of the original settlers had already been using this land as a cemetery, but there's no historical proof for that. The church used the cemetery until the 1940s, and at that time they quit using it. The church fell apart and was no longer active. So the cemetery itself became in disarray. The gravestones were broken or moved or lost. A lot of them had been made out of wood and the wood had rotted off. So there was no actual semblance of there being a cemetery here. As part of the Spring Creek Greenway project, where Commissioner Jack Cagle is building a trail system from Highway 59 all the way through Tomball, we were doing archaeological surveys on the property when we found out about the cemetery. Jack Cagle hired archaeologists to come in and do a complete survey of the cemetery and of the land. They found about 70 graves or possible graves using LIDAR technology. No digging was done in the cemetery itself. We found church records that verify about 70 burials here over the course of 60 to 70 years. So the cemetery itself is very significant because it is one of the few African American cemeteries in northern Harris County. So it takes on an added role of trying to piece in pieces of history that were forgotten and lost. The cemetery is now being maintained behind a wall, a fence, and when the trail system goes through, nothing in the cemetery will be disturbed. And we will then open it to the public and hopefully have some markers and some other information about the cemetery at that time. Thank you for joining us at historic Spring Creek Park today. Come on out and visit the park and enjoy it for yourself.